sees himself still more as an American in Israel than an Israeli. So
that
that's
individual being you.
Yeah, me. That those of us, the Alan Goodmans or whatever, I mean, who are still primarily overwhelmed with the vision of Israel and the idealism and everything that Israel represents and has to represent and one day will ultimately be able to achieve. The average Israeli still sees himself primarily like that Amiram, you know, this big, tough, you know, Sabra that at all costs you avoid the maudlin sentimentality that this film oozes, you know, that the Israeli may be that sentimental, but he keeps it to himself. He certainly doesn't, you know, show it. So if the Israelis would make films about the War of Independence, they certainly would not want to do it in this kind of, you know, soft, schmaltzy way. And therefore they would do it in more seriously, and I think it's simply too close. For example, they would, if Israelis would make films about this, it would be on the role of the Haganah versus the Irgun, or the real internecine fighting that was going on in the Jewish community, none of which
within the Jewish community,
within the Jewish community, who was responsible and who did that, all of which you're beginning to talk about now. So I think that on the one hand, it's too soon, you know, for any kind of perspective in that. And I think with everything that's going on in Israel, I think what's going on in Israel now is a fascinating, difficult period. I mean, as a result of the war in Lebanon and everything that's happened, there's a lot of soul searching going on in Israel. There's and there is now a real battle for the visions of Israel. Different groups contending in terms of what kind of vision, what they want of Israel, and which way Israel will be. Whether you know, whether for the government, against the government, religious. I mean, really deep things. And obviously, we all know that we have gone through and we're going through a traumatic experience. As a result of that, there's a whole rethinking, and I think in a few years you may see many more films about the War of Independence, what happened, what went wrong. Not only in the war, but you know, if this was the beginning of Israel, the vision of Israel.
But dealing with difficult issues related to the war.
Yeah,
not
merely. See, not merely this, because this on one level, I think it was actually more honest than I expected, than I remembered. You know, I mean, they showed different things, they showed different elements, and all like that. But obviously, there were many things you didn't talk about. I don't think you would. Nobody really talks here in terms of. The others who suffered in the war, there were Palestinians. I mean, you know, what happened to them? It was not merely Arabs from outside who invaded Israel. There was a problem. You had lots of people there. What was their intention? What was their hopes? What were their aspirations? How did they suffer from the fact that they were misled by their people and their leadership? All of which, you know, one way, one day has to be dealt with, and it's not yet the time.
2 weeks ago, we saw They Were 10, Him Hayu Asara. And David Sidorsky did an analysis of the myth. In effect, we see it repeated here, the myth or that legend that was Israel. In a certain sense, we were giggling at the love relationship, but in a way, we're also taking a more tough look at what this myth is.
I don't know if we're taking a tough look, but I really want to emphasize, because I believe it very, very deeply. As much as we can be critical of Israel now, and I think the American Jewish community, and not only the Jewish community, too many people here, are overly critical because they gambled everything on Israel. You know, and Israel was supposed to be their simplistic answer for all their problems. You know, everything was supposed to be right, and the fact that it has not proved to be perfect, you have a terrible sense of betrayal and rejection. You know. And I think you have to be very, very, you know, careful with that. So with all the criticism, and I certainly, you know, listen, I am someone who thinks that much of what present government policy is in terms of it in Israel is a tragedy and a disaster, you know, for Israel and the Jewish people. Let me say this, I believe it very, very strongly. The only way to understand what's going on with Israel is that dream is still there. Because understand this, while people may be frustrated and upset and angry, no one, or I shouldn't say, with very, very few exceptions, if you don't believe all of this is for something more than just, living there, why the hell should anyone stay there? Why the hell should anyone stay and pay the heaviest taxes in the world and really be in danger of your own, physical, if it's not for, for something? So you really have that sense of, of vision. And part of the anger that you find in many parts in Israel is it's not working, and why isn't it working, and what can we do to make it and make it better? So I think you should be very careful not to misinterpret the criticism and the sense of rejection, and you're taking more serious analysis that still in no way, really in no way, counteracts the fundamental commitment. And if you saw it beautifully expressed in this movie, in terms of all the hopes and dreams that everyone had. All right, it hasn't turned out that way. I mean, according to this movie, it should have been painful, and people died, and look at all the sacrifice. And when you had that final scene and you looked at the new Israel, you should have come back 2 years later, and everybody should have been happy in their in their two-car garages, and and the whole desert would have been irrigated.
It's the new Israel irrigated with the blood of these people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's still there.
No, what I'm saying is the theory was the final scene should have been everybody could have the two-car family and the beautiful thing, and there would have been peace and brotherhood, and we would have built the great society, and Israel would have been the vision of Ben Gurion and the Switzerland of the Middle East, but it hasn't worked yet. Obviously, it hasn't worked yet, and there's a sense of distress, anger, bitterness, and all of that. But we should not go overboard with that.
Let me now turn it over to you. Do you have any questions? Is there anyone who'd like to ask Professor Pollack a question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering why you eliminated one of Professor Pollack's important credentials when you introduced him. He's a former president of the Labor Zionist Alliance, and that might account for some of his anger at the present government, since it's not a Labor government.
I'm sorry. I thought. Well, I shouldn't say yes. Whenever I speak, and I do a great deal of speaking, I say very, very clearly, I am very much opposed to many of the policies of the present government of Israel. From that point of view, I express a significant element of the population of Israel and the population all over the world. One of the things I understand, I talk about there are different visions of Israel. There really are. There's a major, major ideological battle going on in Israel. There's a vision of the group that, let's say, used to represent the previous government in terms of the Labor Society. There's a vision of the ideological group that represents one wing of the government of Israel. There's a vision of a religious community. It's not merely labor and, pro-government or anti-government. There are different visions going on. You have to understand that, because without understanding that, and it's not merely a political battle for power in Israel. That's a simple way to that's a simple thing to understand. The Jewish state is not yet the ideal state that anybody wanted it to be. And different people have different visions of what that Israel should be. And that's a battle that's going on for heart and soul of Israel. And that battle is very, very deep and very, very real.
And Alan, indeed, you speak as an Israeli.
Yeah.
Not as an American.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, let me say this. The fact that whether I'm Israeli or not, what I will say, there is a battle going on for the heart and soul of Israel. And it's not a battle pro or con government of Israel. It's a battle for a vision of what Israel should be. Since I am not only an Israeli, but I am a Zionist, and I believe what happens in Israel affects every Jew anywhere in the world, I believe it is not only the right, I think it's incumbent upon any Jew who sees himself concerned and committed to the Jewish future to get involved in the fight what kind of Israel you want it to be.
Are there any questions? Yes.
What exactly is the vision of the secular Zionism? Who does not view his relationship with the state in a religious sense?
What is the vision of the secular Zionist? Yeah. I can tell you what's mine. Or let me put it this way. I can define it more in negative terms than I can in positive terms. The vision of the secular Zionist said as follows. What your relationship is with the Almighty is a personal matter. But Israel should be the embodiment of a new kind of society that would be the product of the best of the ethos of our people. So in that secular Zionist, tradition, The thrust was, we're going to be an egalitarian society. We're going to create new forms of society. I mean, the kibbutz became the epitome of that kind of vision. Not so much as an economic force in terms, that it was, but this was going to be the dream of a Jewish state creating a new form of society that would be a new form of man's relationship, to man, and all of that was going to be, a central force. This is why in those early years, I'm talking about even the early years of the state, the kibbutz, which represented a very, very insignificant percentage of the population of Israel, was always looked upon as an ideal to strive for, and they played a tremendous role in society. So that kind of element, the kibbutz, the histadrut, the new forms of society, the new forms of societal organization, was supposed to be ideal. I think it's very clear, very, very clear. I say this with sadness. For Israel, I say this also as a secularist for sadness. None of the forms that secular Judaism have ever been able to create, whether it was radio station WEVD in the United States or some of the forms there in Israel, have been able to be maintained over an extended period of time without losing their vitality. I don't think there's any question today that many of those forms that were created in the socialist secular society, whether of the histadrut or the kibbutz or the cooperative movement, have not succeeded in maintaining a vision that can give a sense of purpose and meaning for a new generation in Israel. And I don't think there's any question that the election of the Likud government in 1977 owed as much to a sense of rejection of the fact that a previous vision simply was no longer viable as it was to anyone who was attracted to the alternate vision that was projected. So where that vision will be, I do not know. I have to tell you the truth, I do not know. But I will say it's this, it's in that element that says, create a form of society that will express the best of our view, coming from our heritage, of which religion was a great part, is a great part of our heritage. Talking about a way the society should be built, expressing man's relationship to man in a way of solving some of the universal problems that beset mankind in our form of way. It has to be in that direction. Just as I will say, the alternate vision that is being projected now, and here I want to make my point clear, I'm talking about visions of society as opposed to policies of government, in terms of a religious-based nationalist view of the world, is very appealing to a certain element, and you find that in Israel, and very, very unappealing to large percentage of the population, which is why the polarization is going is so extreme in Israel. I have a strong feeling. Maybe it's based on hope and faith, because ultimately I'm a good Jew, which means you got to be an optimist, a cynical realist, but an optimist nonetheless. A short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist, because the alternate vision, and again at the risk of caricature, the Khomeini, the combination of Khomeinism and Kahanism, which is appealing to some but abhorrent to others, is going to call forth a revitalization in a new form of the old vision. But you have a lot of old forms in Israel. Just like with the Jewish secularism in the United States, you have a lot of old forms lying around that people worship. I mean, I look around, some of my old Yiddishist friends worship some of the Yiddishist forms as a kind of paean of religiosity, which they rejected, when they became Yiddishists. But so you have lots of forms going around. The content I'm not quite sure of, but it has to be in the area of the societal form.
Okay. Yes, sir.